Hello and welcome to Scrum Adventures. In Scrum Adventures, we'll be taking a look at a Scrum team and we'll be finding out what exactly Scrum is in a few minutes. Let's jump in and get started by taking a look at the roles in Scrum. You might have heard of the 3-5-3 configuration. There are 3 roles, 5 ceremonies, and 3 artifacts. Let's start off by meeting the team.
I am the product owner and I am part of the team. I determine the product vision and people call me the Chief Value Officer. I act as the customer's representative and I am a mouthpiece for the end user. You see me with a bunch of money because I am all about the value that I deliver to the folks I represent from the main business. My focus is to identify and prioritize the product backlog and identify acceptance criteria for items on the backlog. I work closely with the team to clarify items on the backlog if needed. Sometimes people incorrectly think I have authority over the team, but I don't. Just a team member.
I am the Scrum Master. My job is to ensure that the team is following Scrum practices. One of my responsibilities is removing any impediments or obstacles keeping my awesome team from making progress. Contrary to what a lot of people think, I do not have any authority whatsoever over the team. Yep. Let that sink in for a moment. You see, I find a lot of project managers thinking I should have some sort of power over the developers. Why on earth do they think that? That is just weird. In this world of Scrum, we rely on the power of a self-organizing, self-managed, self-led team. And one more thing. Burn-down charts are not mandatory in Agile.
We are the developers. We're also known as the development team, but most importantly we are in the Scrum team, and we are committed to achieving any aspect of a usable increment each sprint. The skills we need are often broad, and they vary with the domain of work. Nevertheless, we are accountable for creating a plan for the sprint, the sprint backlog, instilling quality by adhering to a definition of done, adapting our plan each day towards the sprint goal, and holding each other accountable as professionals. If you want the best Agile team, start by hiring the right people. Adults. Don't hire anyone that will not be a good fit for your team, because once the 5 stages of team development kick in, you will either have a blessing or a curse on your hands.
So the team works for a gaming company and they're working on a video game machine. It started off with the stakeholders having a bright idea of what exactly they wanted. They started off by engaging the product owner in discussions. And as they worked together, they began crafting ideas. Now, you don't really hear a lot about these ideas in the world of Scrum, but you could look at this as some form of backlog preparation. And this is where the backlog begins to take form. So you already know the backlog is a list of all the work presented in story form for a team. There's no need to create all the stories, but just enough stories, sufficient stories to get the project rolling along. Just enough to understand the first release, at least in broad brushstrokes. Product owners, as you've met the product owner, or a product owner value team that includes the product manager and all relevant product owners for that area of the product, might produce a product roadmap. Now, this is not Scrum doctrine. This is ACP doctrine. And this can be found on page 52 of the Agile Practice Guide. Now, while it's not explicit Scrum doctrine, it does help you get an idea of how stories get into what we know to be the product backlog. The product backlog, as you know, is an ordered list of user stories. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we proceed. The next thing that happens is the product owner and the team begin working on sprint planning. And in sprint planning, the team works together to better understand what exactly is in the product backlog. We also refer to this in the Agile Practice Guide as planning for iteration-based Agile. You just call it sprint planning. Now, we think about capacity because each team's capacity is different. Each individual's capacity is different. And therefore, each team member will focus on what exactly they can do within an iteration. How do they know what they can do? The stories would have been scored. And at this point, the team members know how much time they can dedicate to the entire sprint. So teams consider their story size, so they don't try to commit to more stories than their team capacity to complete within one iteration. In fact, as a rule of thumb, we often say start off with 6 hours in a day, not 8 hours, because you'll be involved with email, doing other work, maybe even taking your dog to the vet, who knows? When people are unavailable, holidays, vacations, and things like that, it prevents people from participating in the next set of work. The product owner understands that the team has reduced capacity, and the team will not be available to finish the same amount of work as it finished in the previous time period. This should definitely be considered so as to understand what the team can really commit to. Because when the team has a reduced capacity, they'll only plan for work that meets that capacity. So when all is said and done, the team will estimate what they can complete. And that is a measure of capacity. Teams cannot predict with 100% certainty what they can deliver, as they cannot know the unexpected. And that's what Agile is all about. And Scrum is one of the frameworks we use in order to execute our Agile mindset of principles and behaviors. When product owners make the story smaller and the team see progress in the form of a finished product, teams learn what they're able to do in the future. Agile teams do not plan just once in a single chunk. Instead, they plan a little, deliver, learn, and then replan, and they do this in sprints. It's kind of like a PDCA cycle within the sprint, and repeat that again and again. Plan, do, check, act. Do it again and again. When all is said and done after sprint planning, the team derives what we call a sprint backlog. And the sprint backlog is that chunk of work that the team will embark on within the sprint. Enter into the sprint. What exactly is a sprint? The sprint is a container for all the other events within the sprint. So look at it as a container of 4 weeks or less. And when we say less, it could be 1 week, a few days, 3 weeks, so on and so forth. Now, within the sprint, the team gets the work done. Remember, in sprint planning, the team committed to getting the work done. Well, now they're working. And within the sprint, every 24 hours, there's something we call a daily scrum. Some people refer to this as a daily stand-up meeting, but not every team is able to stand. You could have individuals with disabilities. So just be aware of that. It could be called something else. But the bottom line is the team meets and the team discusses. In other words, answers to 3 questions. The 3 questions: what did you do yesterday? What will you do today? And what are the impediments that are in your way? Now, these 3 questions are pretty simplistic. There's more to these questions. In order to get the most out of these questions, you should actually be asking the question, what have you done since our last meeting to move us towards the sprint goal? What will you do between now and our next meeting to move you towards the sprint goal? Because it may not be a daily scrum. It may not be a daily stand-up meeting. But the bottom line is to understand what has been done to advance towards the goal. It becomes more of a planning meeting. What are the impediments that are in your way? And if there's any team member or scrum master is in attendance, anyone knows they can remove those impediments, then we go for those impediments after the meeting. So in the daily scrum, we could do that, or we could do something else, which is known as walk the board. And in walking the board, we start with those furthest to the right, closest to getting done, and we begin to move backwards and ask, what do we need to do to get this item to done, and so on. Be aware of those 2 methods, especially for your test. Now, midway in the sprint, somewhere, there is another event that will be held. And this event, as you can see, the product owner in attendance, you can see the product backlog. Why? Because it's called backlog refinement. And backlog refinement is a very important ceremony because it helps us to be proactive. In fact, backlog refinement is not discussed as a ceremony in the Scrum Guide. And the reason is probably because it is something that should happen not just one time within the sprint, but all throughout. But anyway, we have it here for the record as being something that you do somewhere in the middle of the iteration. In the Agile Practice Guide on page 52, it reads, in iteration-based Agile, the product owner often works with the team to prepare some stories for the upcoming iteration during 1 or more sessions in the middle of the iteration. The purpose of these meetings is to refine enough stories so the team understands what the stories are and how large the stories are in relation to each other. There's no consensus on how long the refinement should be. There's a continuum of just-in-time refinement for flow-based Agile. The team takes the next card off the to-do column and discusses it. Many iteration-based Agile teams use a time-boxed 1-hour discussion Midway through a 2-week iteration, the team selects an iteration duration that provides them frequent enough feedback. Multiple refinement discussions for iteration-based Agile teams. Teams can use this when they are new to the product area, or the problem domain. The bottom line is they are going to work in getting those stories to the definition of ready. What do we mean by ready? Well, a quick guide to ready is in the INVEST acronym. INVEST stands for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small enough to fit within a sprint, and testable. Now, of course, the team continues working on the work, and eventually they get to the point where they have what we will call the increment. When we say increment, another name we could use is potentially shippable increment, or PSI. Now, after the PSI has been produced, when it's done from the lens of the team, what follows is what we refer to as a demo. The demo is attended by the stakeholders, and they will review the increment along with the team. Now, some rather important language about this does exist in the Scrum Guide. So if you go to scrumguides.org and you read directly from the Scrum Guide, you will realize that you should not look at this as just a mere demo. In fact, the language reads, the sprint review is the second to the last of the sprint and is time boxed to a maximum of 4 hours for a 1-month sprint. For shorter sprints, the event is usually shorter. And during the event, the Scrum team and the stakeholders review what was accomplished in the sprint and what has changed in the environment. Based on this information, attendees collaborate on what to do next. The product backlog may also be adjusted to meet new opportunities. The sprint review is a working session, and the Scrum team should avoid limiting it to a presentation. So a lot could happen in this meeting. Like I said, inspect the outcome of the sprint and determine future adaptations. The Scrum team presents the results of their work to those stakeholders, and progress towards the product goal is discussed. So again, what do we call this meeting? The formal name is a sprint review, also known as a demo. And that leads us to the final meeting of the sprint, and it's known as the sprint retrospective. Do not compare the retrospective to your average lessons learned meeting. No, there's a lot more that happens here, but it stays here. Whatever happens in the retrospective should not escape the retrospective. Hence the term Agile Vegas. Whatever happens stays there. Now, unlike the traditional world where we could document to our heart's content, our aim is not to document and incriminate the team members who feel comfortable and are in the presence of their friends and therefore drop their guard and can say anything. We don't document here. Instead, we discuss, interact, and find out what went well and what didn't. The purpose of the retrospective is to plan ways to increase quality and effectiveness. The Scrum team inspects how the last sprint went with regards to individuals, interactions, processes, tools, and their definition of done. Inspected elements often vary with the domain of work. Assumptions that led them astray are identified and their origins explored. The Scrum team discusses what went well during the sprint, what problems it encountered, and how those problems were or were not solved. The Scrum team identifies the most helpful changes to improve its effectiveness. The most impactful improvements are addressed as soon as possible. They may even be added to the sprint backlog for the next sprint. They may. Now, to give you a visual, it means that the team has opportunities for improvement. We generate them from the sprint retrospective, and it ultimately will get put into the product backlog and will then make its way at some point, maybe the very next sprint, into the sprint backlog. And that concludes our review of Scrum. In our next episode, we'll get into more of the ceremonies. See you there.